welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurk.
And hi, my name's Nick Butcher.
And today we have a special episode where we're going to talk about, we're going to dive into one of the apps that was previously covered on the GDG App Clinic Oslo in Norway, for those of you that aren't very good with geography. And then we're going to dive into some details on design consistency, specifically kind of talking about when you should think about your brand versus Holo and Android design principles, and kind of when those meet. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to be talking about one app today. I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, but it's fin.no. It's kind of like a market type app, almost like an eBay, I'd say. And again, everything was in Norwegian, so I wasn't able to fully grasp the full extent of the app, but it is kind of like a market type app that lets you look at products, find products. It's got a very deep hierarchy. So there are lots of different parts of the app, which we'll talk about. But yeah, so let's just dive in. So here's one of the first screens that you'll see in the app. You'll notice that it's kind of like an intro screen. It's very nice. It kind of introduces you to the main character, the main spokesperson for this company, this kind of cute cat character. And then you immediately jump into content, which is nice. There's no heavy introduction screen. There's no like dashboard pattern. You immediately get content, and this primary content area is all about kind of posts that this company releases, I believe. And then for each post, there's kind of listings associated with those. So you'll see here that there's this one post that talks about something that's on the market right now. I believe it's a property for sale or for rent. And then there's another about wedding dresses or something like that. So there's a couple of other details in the app which we'll talk about throughout. But we also wanted to talk about some of the things that we decided to change, some of the things that we decided to tweak around with. So the first is you'll notice that there's this kind of top bar. It's not really an action bar. It has the logo in the middle, whereas the action bar usually has the logo in the left. And it has affordances for search as well as filter, and then login, which is on the right. There's also a couple of other things you'll see here. There's this, for each one of these posts, you can actually click this button here to take you to all the listings related to that post, versus if there's only one item, you'll only just see one here. There's no kind of arrow there. So we found that a little bit confusing, that there were two different states, the two different places that this touch area could lead you to, either just the single listing or the full set of listings. Okay, so let's see what we did with this. Actually, before we do that, Nick, do you have any thoughts, anything to share?
No, I mean, overall, it's a kind of quite clean and flat design, which is very modern and nice looking. But there's just a few things which kind of didn't quite sit right for me in the Android pattern. So let's see what we've done with the screen.
Yeah. So the first thing we did was we added a proper action bar. Actually, I'll just zoom in here. We added a proper action bar. We also added a navigation drawer, which we'll talk about in just a second. But we also tweaked a lot of the metrics, and that's one of the things that I definitely tend to harp on when I look at apps, is metrics, spacing, font sizes, margins, paddings, things like that. You'll notice that in the original, the text, I guess the titles are kind of cramped with the image to the left. And then the font sizes kind of vary throughout. So one of the things we did was we standardized some of the font sizes as well as some of the margins. We use a standard 16-dip kind of base grid. We have 16-dip margins throughout. We use 8-dip in some places. But you'll notice that it's just a little more properly spaced out, in my opinion. We also obviously did some tweaks here in terms of, rather than using these card-style boxes to hold, a single post with its associated listings, we kind of use this almost like a section header styling, where you have a gray background for the post itself, the text of the post, or the comment, I guess, and then each of the items, which is really the thing you want to pop the most, it has a slightly different styling, a lighter background. We also, in the action bar, we moved search into its proper position at the top right. We left the overflow for things like my profile, which is something that was given a lot of prominence here, but we decided to relegate it to the overflow, since that's kind of a very common place to put it. And then we added the navigation jar, which we'll show in a second. Before we move on to the next screen, Nick, any comments?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm a particularly big fan of the typography. I find screens which have a large range of different type sizes on them can feel messy to me. It's almost like people trying too hard to communicate the information hierarchy, and it ends up just getting a little bit confused. I think you've done a really nice job here of cleaning up the typographic palette here. So using fewer type sizes, but using like font weight and color instead to communicate what is important and what is less important right now. So I think that's a really nice job. Yep. I also really like the little profile photos with the dotted lines. I think that works really, really well to communicate that the entry, the white background post is a child of the kind of announcement post.
Yeah, and I'd say that the profile photos are very small in the current version. It's definitely something that when possible, when you have imagery, when you have high resolution photos, things like that, you should definitely try to use them as much as possible. Give them more space than you normally may. So definitely consider using larger images where possible.
I think that's one of my takeaways from Google I/O this year from Alex Barborg's talk on cognitive science, that you have a special part of your brain which is great at parsing photos, pictures of people, and recognize them in kind of like almost instantaneously for a page, rather than having to scan through and read names and so on. So maybe not with a cat photo, but if this is going to be like a person often, then I think making the most of those images is a good thing.
Exactly. So let's move on to the next screen, which is the actually, this is just another example. As you scroll down, you would obviously see more items, and you'd have the overflow, which would contain my profile settings, help about, the standard stuff that you'd put there.
Yeah, it's worth recapping here as well, like the rules we kind of tend to think about for when things should be in action, which is immediately available on the action bar, and when things should get demoted. I'd say something like my profile is going to be an uncommon action. You're not going to be clicking into that many times, right? So that probably should always go into the action overflow, similar to how help and settings and about would always go in the action overflow as uncommon actions. You wouldn't want to perhaps promote this to a kind of action item, even if there was space, say, on a larger device, because it's like not a common action.
Another thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to kind of encourage the user to log in to create an account for your app, using the overflow for that is probably not a good idea. You're probably not going to get too much engagement there. But what you could do is have like a butter bar or something, like a dismissible butter bar show up that says, along the bottom of the screen that says, hey, if you log in, you get this, and this, value, or just kind of immediately explain the benefits, rather than showing like an icon always available on screen. Just make it contextual. If you want the user to log in or register, make sure that they see a kind of a nice big prominent bar that they can also dismiss if they don't really want to log in. So let's move on to the next. Actually, this is the scroll down version. You notice that rather than having this extra arrow here to show all the listings, we just have like an all listings item at the very bottom. So you'd show maybe 3 or 4 items as kind of a summary of the post, and then at the bottom you'd click on you'd touch all listings to take you there. So let's look at the jar. So you have right now, if you touch that top left search icon, you get this, I guess, it's kind of like a navigation jar to the left. It shows you the list of categories as well as a list of recent searches, along with search itself. So search is kind of part of this bar. And it makes sense in terms of proximity, right? The search bar is right next to the recent searches. However, I mean, it's a somewhat of an uncommon place for search. Users really expect search to be in the action bar immediately available, not 2 touches away, but immediately kind of 1 touch away. And it's not really violating any strong semantic rules for the navigation jar. There aren't any actions in here except for search, but it is kind of pushing the content over, pushing the top bar over, and so in terms of the interaction itself, it's not really violating the guidelines, but it's not adhering to the guidelines that we have set out. So what we decided to do is see what this would look like with a proper new navigation jar. So you have home at the top, which is kind of your stream per se. And then each of the other things are still represented there. We also added a couple of things like section headers to make sure that it's clear what you're looking at. And yeah, you could do the same things. You can like dismiss recent searches. You can you can switch between the different categories and things like that. But the core point here is that since the action bar doesn't slide out of the way, search is still accessible. Search is still an action that's there in the action bar. Because it's globally relevant, it's not contextually relevant to the screen that the navigation jar is hiding. So it's totally fine to leave that action there when the navigation jar is exposed. Okay, let's see. So what else did we do here? So once you jump into, or once you actually perform a search, let's say you press one of these categories or click on a recent search, you get taken to this screen, which again has those persistent top left and top right, I guess, jars available, and it also lets you sort. So the issue here is that there isn't a concept of really hierarchy, and you're kind of like just at another flat part of the app. You're just at another part of the app that happens to be search results. There's no quick way besides pressing the back button to get home. So what we did here was we actually mirrored a lot of the things we copied a lot of the things from the original or the current app. We still have obviously the images on the left and the metadata on the right, and obviously we did some typographic treatments there, but we kept the navigation jar. I'll actually talk about that in a second. And then we moved the common actions of things like filtering and sorting, which we'll talk about in a second, into the action bar in their normal place. Now, in terms of the navigation jar, some folks may think, oh, why isn't there an up button here? Now, the reason for this, and this is kind of contentious, you could probably go either way on it. My thinking here was that since these recent searches are represented in the navigation jar, so they're here, right? Pizza or wedding dresses. Since they're represented there, they should actually those screens that you get taken to when you press those should appear in the navigation jar, or should have the navigation jar affordance. And this is in accordance with the guidelines that we have set out. So if you touch something in a navigation jar and you get taken to a new screen, that screen should have access to the same navigation jar. So you could probably go either way. I mean, a lot of folks think that on search screens you could have an up button. You should have an up button, and I guess this is just one way to do it. And then also you have access to the refined search. So if you actually want to filter further, you could touch it up there, and then everything else in the screen. So Nick, before we move on, any comments or anything like that?
No, just a few comments on the visual design as well. I think you did a nice job of tightening up the visual design on this. I think especially the treatment of the images and having them be basically flush with the side and the below item works really, really well. So basically you're using as much space as you can to show rich imagery, which is much quicker to scan than a textual description. So I think that's really, really nice how you give them that room to show off.
Cool. Okay, so let's look at a couple of details here. The first is that if you touch the recent search, like wedding dresses, that could be populated in the top, so that could effectively be an editable title. And if you move on here, so you'll notice that sort is a sub-menu. So when you touch the sort icon, you get a list of sort options like relevance, price, or availability. These should actually have radio buttons next to them. That's a design issue, kind of like a bug there. These should have radio buttons showing what the current sort is as well. And then the most interesting part of this, I'd say, is the filtering. So actually, I lied a bit. When you touch on, let me see if I can go back here. When you touch here, right? So when you touch here, you actually don't get immediately taken to the results screen. You get taken to a filter interstitial first. So you actually get taken to, wow, this is, let me see if I can get to it. You actually get taken here first. So as soon as you touch a category, you get taken to a filter screen, which then you can obviously modify, and then once you choose the right filters, you can swipe over to see the results. So instead of having another left pane, what we decided to do is, filtering is really kind of like an action. It's the act of filtering your current set of results. So we decided to do is move this over to the right as a right jar, as kind of something that's on the right hand side, like a filter, or you could do something like layer selection if you're looking at a map or something like that. So we moved filtering to the right. You'll notice that it's not just a jar. it's not just a drawer, it's actually also available as an action button. So if you touch the filter icon there, it actually should expand and collapse the filter pane. This is very similar to how Google Plus or Google One today do notifications. So the idea here is that instead of being taken directly to the search results, you could actually take the user to the search results screen, but immediately expose the right-hand filter jar. And then once they make the selections, they could just swipe it out of the way.
I'm a big fan of this. Like the idea of changing the content of the navigation drawer I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, it's such an important facility to be able to navigate around the application. The idea of having this kind of different modes in which you're in, this kind of like lack of stability almost. I'm not a huge fan of it. So I think it's much cleaner. And also the fact that filtering tends to be an action. It's not really navigation. It's kind of acting upon the data you've already navigated to. It definitely maps to an action, and therefore kind of like the right-hand side of the action bar in Android's kind of model. So I think this is much better.
Exactly. So you'll notice here that there's kind of like an up button or a back button inside of the navigation drawer. Anytime you see that, definitely try to avoid that. The only type of hierarchy you should have within the drawer is collapsible sections. So you can have kind of like a collapsible item within the drawer, but definitely if you have different entire contexts within the drawer, that's something that you should try to avoid. And I think there may have been that was it. So that was the entire kind of type of redesign we did for this app. Now, before we move on, I just want to say the app itself is designed very well. It performs really quickly. The image loading is very good. So it's a very, very solid app. And this is also a beta, so it's not quite out yet. It's a great app. You should definitely check it out. But these are some of the ways in which we would kind of improve the navigation, as well as separate out the concept of navigation from actions such as filter. With that, should we move on to design consistency, Nick?
Yeah, let's.
All right.
So this is a topic we've been chewing on for a little while, and I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with out there. Understanding how do you design for Android, and how do you have that consistent with the rest of your brand and application and so on out there. So when we talk about consistency, there's a few kind of dimensions we want to kind of really define and really kind of dig into. The first one is like about cross-platform. So obviously there's a bunch of different OS platforms out there which you, as your application, your service, whatever it might be, probably wants to be present on. So there's got to be an element of consistency, so users know how to use your application across these. The next dimension we think about is kind of like your branding, really. Like, so even if you're running on these different platforms, you want to be recognizable as the same service, and how do you kind of achieve that? And the next dimension we think about, so when we're talking specifically about Android, Android obviously has its own look and feel, its own interaction patterns and so forth, kind of wrapped up in the Holo design language and kind of the Android design patterns. So how do you kind of like reconcile being consistent with that? So there's a lot of kind of like confusion and choice out there. So to tackle those, we kind of break it down into 3 kind of design disciplines. So we're going to talk individually about your information design, your interaction design, and your visual design, and kind of how to be consistent with those. So first up, the information design. Like, we're really not Android or the holographic, the Holo design language really isn't going to kind of dictate to you or tell you anything here. There's nothing stopping you from using the same information architecture that you use, say if you already have a web property or a different platform. This is all down to your application. I think this just comes down to good design, where you want to sit down and like map out what the base entities are in the information architecture of your application. But Android isn't going to influence this at all. So this is all kind of on you, on my kind of like slider map we've put together here.
I guess the point I wanted to make here is that the information design, especially for apps or information architecture, especially for apps that have an existing, potentially very large user base, or existing property, on the web or on other mobile platforms, you don't want to compromise your information architecture. You don't have to choose a completely different information architecture just for Android. So when you look at Android, don't think of it as designing a completely separate app. It's really, how do I map my existing information architecture, my existing entities, the objects I deal with, the sibling relationships of things, how do you map those onto Android? So it's really, in this case, with the information architecture portion of the design process, you really have to think about, how do I best communicate my existing content, my current content, and manifest it in an Android-friendly way.
So if you take a look at the example of Gmail, for example, so a property which existed on the web and elsewhere long before Android came along, Android does not dictate anything at all about this. It's obviously using some Android interaction patterns and visual design here, but the information architecture, they're basically messages, conversations, labels, and so forth. This is purely dictated by the product, by Gmail. So Android has no bearing kind of here.
Yeah, and it's very important to make sure that when a user comes from the web to Gmail, not that they immediately see the same exact things. Like, you don't want them to see the exact same, visuals, maybe not even necessarily the exact same, ordering of content, but you do generally want them to immediately understand where things are and what, that all the things that they expect to be there are there.
Right. So the next slice we're looking at is interaction design. So here we say that it is actually more important to get a lot closer to Holo and to the Android design patterns than to anything like really, really bespoke. The reason being that, like, while users kind of like might know your brand and so on, when they're in the context of a mobile device, when I'm on my Android phone and I'm using multiple apps, like, it's very important that your application works the same way as the rest of those applications that are going to be used side by side. So this is where I think interaction patterns such as navigation are really, really critical, that a user instantly knows how to use your application. Some users will have multiple devices, maybe different OSs. I might use the website for one thing and the phone for something else. But in our kind of research and experience, users tend to do like kind of a context switch when they switch between these devices. So I don't expect an application on an Android phone to function exactly like the website. I expect it to function like an Android app, and I kind of expect that to happen. One kind of like point we wanted to make is that bespoke interactions, which are kind of key to your brand, are fine. That's absolutely okay. But it's kind of, if you do have an interaction which is at odds with the Android design patterns, it's working out where it makes sense to back off and where it makes sense to do something more bespoke.
As an example, kind of outside of the mobile context, I mean, on websites, right, or on the web, you have the full breadth of HTML and CSS and styling and stuff to kind of communicate your content, right? But almost every website at the top left, they have a logo. Their navigation is either at the top or along the left side, and that's really just something that's in the culture and kind of the core of the web, right? So people kind of expect that. So that's something where you want to take your information architecture, your content, you want to bring it to the web, but you want to make sure that you use interactions that are very well understood on Android, or not on Android, on the web. And it's the same thing on Android. So you really want to make sure that when you come to a platform, you bring your stuff, you bring your luggage and stuff, but you kind of put it into the right kind of parts of the house, effectively.
Nice metaphor for that. So a couple of examples of this we're going to take a look at. So we've gone for things which are kind of slightly beyond the kind of like stock arrangement of components. So here is an app example from an app called Grand Street. If you haven't seen it or heard of it, it's a recent addition to our new beautiful apps collection on Google Play. It's a lovely app. So here they're doing something quite custom in a way. They're trying to like give as much real estate and space to kind of imagery and description in a very, very beautiful way. So they're bringing very much their own kind of personality and their own information architecture here, but they're kind of blending that with the Android design. So when it comes to things like navigation and performing important actions, here they kind of like get much closer to the kind of action bar paradigm. So while it's not kind of a stock action bar, it's been customized slightly. It's very, very important that users kind of are familiar with that and kind of can understand that, oh, right, this is how I navigate hierarchically, or this is how I perform actions, or this is where I'll look for supplemental actions.
Exactly.
The next example is kind of like the canonical example of that kind of marquee or bespoke interaction is something like Flipboard. So Flipboard's whole kind of value proposition is wrapped up in this kind of magazine style which you can flip around. So that's obviously a very custom interaction for navigation, which is fine. But when it comes to kind of other things like performing actions or hierarchical navigation, they do get much closer to the Android design pattern. So using kind of the action bar affordances. I'd love to see them get slightly closer to kind of more of a stock action bar presentation, but largely they're kind of like following the spirit of, oh, I know where to look for navigation, oh, I know where to look for actions to perform. So here, yeah, these are good examples of where they're doing something kind of custom and trying to bring their own personalities, but marrying it with the Android patterns.
So visual design?
Yeah, so the last kind of like way we want to look at it is looking at the visual design. So this is really a mixture of both your own kind of look and feel along with the Android kind of look and feel. So the idea here is to blend your brand, your own identity, with the Android look and feel. So one example of this might be things like coloring, for example. While Hollow Visual Language talks about, stripping back to the minimum, letting content speak, it's not going to give you any kind of advice about what colors or what palette you should use in your application. This is where you have the opportunity to bring your own personality to an Android app and really kind of like make it instantly recognizable as your brand. So here is this little tip that using a single accent color works really, really well to bring that. So if we go on to the next example, which we've picked, which is Vine, here they're doing that trick using that single strong accent color, this really recognizable kind of minty kind of green color. While this is like a pretty stock action bar, it's instantly recognizable, instantly branded. They've done a really nice job of marrying Android visual design with their own branding, their own look and feel.
I will say that we do make some suggestions on color on the design site, but they're really just suggestions. It's not like every app must follow these, use these colors. But for kind of smaller UI elements where you need like a special green or red or something, you can pick those. But for the core branding, we won't tell you, oh, Android apps must have these colors as kind of their core accent colors. It's really up to you.
Right. And the next example I wanted to show is from the Google Play suite of applications. So these are some screenshots taken from a recent show we did on the Play Store redesign. And this is within one application, the Play Store, but it shows a very nice variation how you can use things like customizing the stock components, like the action bar background, the selected tab indicator, the button color. Just by using color here, you instantly have this kind of branded feel. I know when I'm in the kind of a music application, I know when I've switched to the movies kind of context, or when I'm in a book context. And this goes much deeper, like some of their text boxes are hinted with the same colors, and some of the touch feedback is kind of colored the same way. So basically they use color really, really well to give this strong sense of identity. So it's using pretty stock Android components, but bringing their own brand, their own identity to it.
Yep.
So yeah, just as a quick summary, just to wrap that up, these are kind of like where we feel there's some areas where it's all about your own information architecture, your own kind of object model, and that Hollow is not going to, or Android design isn't going to inform you. Interaction design would say was the other way. It's very important that a user knows how to use your app as soon as they install it, or if they come to it with very little context. But the visuals is very much a kind of a marriage between your own branding and the stock kind of Android look and feel.
The last thing I want to point out is just on the interaction piece. Some of the examples that we talked about, Flipboard and Grand Street. Some of the most obvious interactions on Android are swiping and scrolling. And I'd say that both of those apps, Flipboard does a little bit more custom, but Grand Street especially, it looks very, very custom, but as soon as you open up the app, you kind of start swiping around and things just work as expected. So rather than kind of doing really custom gestural stuff to do basic things like navigate through content, just rely on existing features, existing gestures like scrolling, swiping horizontally, things like that, and users will almost instantly know how to use your app. On top of obviously using the same navigational model, things like the action bar, up affordance, spinners, tabs, things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's not like an all or nothing discussion, right? It's not, you can't say, I have to be consistent with my application because I'm already on other platforms and people won't know how to use my app. There absolutely are elements which you should be consistent to, but there's some elements which is really important to get closer to the kind of Android patterns.
Exactly. All right, I think I think that was it. So with that, thanks everyone for joining. I don't know when we'll have another episode. Oh, actually, wait, there's one thing that we forgot to mention. So we didn't have a design news section today, but one bit of design news is that we did kind of recently announce our beautiful design collection that Nick alluded to. It's a set of 11 apps that the Google Play and actually the Android design team thought were really, really awesome. So definitely check it out if you haven't yet. I believe it's still available on your phone if you just open up the Play Store, go to apps, and scroll down to beautiful design. You should see it. But just in case, we do have links available. So with that, thanks everybody. As always, I'm your host, Roman Urich.
And bye from Nick Butcher.
See you guys next week or the week after or something like that.
Soon.